introducing Dr. Meg Sears, who is going to be talking to us, as you see in the microwave, the idea of a microwave catalyst and how that may have some biological effects. Meg, can you hear us? Can you unmute your microphone?
There we go.
Okay, we hear you. Can you also turn on your camera so that maybe we can see you too?
There we go. Can you see me now?
Yes, we do. Thank you very much. Okay, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm going to do something that's perhaps a little bit brave or foolhardy. I'm going to try to talk about a bit of chemistry. Deborah invited me to share this with you because it's a proposal of a very fundamental mechanism that's highly recognized that would really cover the causality of very low levels of microwave radiation causing biological effects. So I'm speaking in the wee hours of the morning from Ottawa in Canada, where it's a lot colder and we don't have nearly as beautiful oranges to eat as you do in Israel. But thank you ever so much. Now, there we go. So I'm going to talk a bit about chemistry, which is perhaps a bit bold in this context, but I hope that I can help you understand this bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about why it matters in public health and policy. So I'm sure that you've all seen spectra of microwave, of electromagnetic frequencies. And of course, we're talking about the microwaves. And it's commonly said by the regulators that you don't need to worry about the health effects of this kind of thing unless you have bulk heating, because a single photon is too weak to remove an electron from an atom. It's non-ionizing. However, these fields can nudge electrons, and that can be very important as well. So we're talking about very rapidly changing electrical fields, and these basically push and pull on molecules that are electrically non-neutral. And we also have the rapidly changing magnetic fields, as you've discussed with Dr. Paul. And what these do is they act to orient molecules, to orient the biological materials in these fields. But the fields are rapidly changing, so this pushing and pulling comes from this natural forces on these molecules. And of course, we have a carrier wave, something like what is shown in here, and then superimposed upon the carrier wave, of course, is the signal. So we have very irregular fields, and what's biologically important, well, part of what's biologically important is the rate of change of the fields. So although we have a nominal frequency, the biologically effective frequencies are much higher and much, they're over a much greater range. So chemistry, the basis of life, basically you have electrical attraction of opposite charges, which bring together atoms and molecules. And at the risk of vastly oversimplification, this is really the basis of chemistry. You have repulsion of identical charges. So as a chemical reaction proceeds, you start off with reactants, and then before they actually react, it's important that they get to a transition state. It takes some energy for them to actually achieve this transition state, and it's, you know, there's a certain lack of certainty that they will actually achieve this kind of transition state. And then the reaction occurs and you get a product. And depending upon the types of reactions, these are more or less reversible. And the speed and the reversibility of this chemical reaction is determined actually by this activation energy to align the reactants and to initiate reactions. And we actually know that with microwave or radiofrequency radiation, this proceeds differently. The range and the proportion of products may be different. If you have more than 2 reactants, it's possible they would react in different ways, and you could have different products. Biochemical reactions are generally faster, and they occur at lower temperatures when you use microwave or radiofrequency radiation compared with physical heating. And there's one reference here that describes this, although there's actually an entire journal about microwave chemistry. Who knew? And this journal covers the synthesis of novel organic, organometallic, inorganic chemicals and complexes. Talks about the kinetics and the mechanistics, the studies of this microwave-induced chemical reactions. And it is applied in many different fields. What's notable is we don't have the only medical implications that are covered in this journal are production of pharmaceuticals. And it's been going since 2014. So this is a fairly well-established field. I actually first heard about it when I was working in chemical engineering and applied chemistry at University of Toronto back in the 70s. I wasn't working on it, and I just heard from somebody that, oh, I would never have thought that you actually get different reactions when you apply microwave energy as opposed to a steam jacket to have a chemical reaction proceed. And since chemical engineers and chemists are sort of over-glorified cooks at this time, so didn't really strike me as being too unusual, because that's what microwave energy does, is it cooks, but it does much more than that. So here's a diagram that is very commonly shown in chemistry to give you an idea of what's meant by an activation energy. We're starting with compound X on the left-hand side. It's going to proceed to the activation state where it's aligned, and then turn into compound Y. And if you have what's called a catalyst that helps with the alignment and helps to shuffle things along, you still need the entire change in energy overall. But that activation energy, that hump that you have to get over, is much reduced if you have the catalyst. And that's why microwave radiation is called a catalyst. Enzymes are catalysts. So if we apply this to biochemistry, we have microwave catalysis that makes reactions proceed more quickly, and we can end up with different product distributions. And this is particularly true in multi-phase systems. So we have systems where there are oil droplets in water, and then you have, along with that, your reactants. And on the surfaces of these oil droplets, these reactants can be aligned in particular ways because they have hydrophobic ends and portions of the molecule, and hydrophilic portions of the molecule. So having this multi-phase system actually makes this microwave catalysis work a lot better. And now we're starting to think, well, we've got things a bit like that in our bodies. We have membranes. But before we get to that, it's important for you to realize that even water is a polar molecule. It's more negatively charged on the oxygens and more positively charged on hydrogen atoms. And we put our cup of water in the microwave oven, and the water is vibrated by the microwave radiation because of this polarity. So the electrical fields will interact with these proteins, the enzymes, the ionophores, or the cation pores, as Dr. Paul was talking. We have magnetic fields. And then, of course, there are some neutral substances, like lipids, that are more or less transparent to microwave and radiofrequency radiation. And they don't absorb nearly as much of the energy, so they're not nearly as affected. This was seen yesterday in Dr. Melnick's presentation, where he was showing how much energy was absorbed by different types of tissues, and the fat tissues absorb much more than other tissues. And this is actually being used. So we have chemists who are exploiting something which our regulators are telling us doesn't happen. So one example is an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And this is a common lab test. Usually it's done actually in a laboratory because it takes a very long time. But if instead of heating it just using some kind of hot plate, you use microwave radiation, you change the time to develop this test from about 18 hours to less than 5 minutes, and it changes the test from something that you have to send away to the lab to something that can be done on the counter in the doctor's office. So this whole microwave catalysis is something which is exploited. It's established. There's no doubt about it. And if we are going to look at the implications for our, for biochemistry, and then move that on to the actual biology, we will think about membranes, because in the center of the membranes, we have the lipids, which do not absorb nearly as much energy as the phospho groups that are on the exterior of the membranes. And we also have embedded partially or completely through the membranes things that are polar. So if you look across this image of the types of things that are on membranes, you'll see that some of them are going to be much more highly affected by microwave radiation than other portions. And this is why when you have some molecules that are tugged and jiggled more than others, then this system breaks down. So for function, we have this localized stress via polar constituents that affects this lipid bilayer membrane. So what kinds of things are we going to see? We're going to see the shedding of some of these surface proteins. We're going to see increased leakage of ionophores, and Dr. Paul talked about calcium. We will also see disruption of membrane-associated reactions, such as metabolism and synthesis of macromolecules in all of the parts of the cell that rely upon membranes. So the mitochondria, the ribosomes, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and so on. We'll also see disruption of barriers such as the blood-brain barrier. We'll see myelin damage, testes damage, eye damage, and so on. So on a very, very basic level, in the cell, this cellular factory, on the factory floor, we have the membranes in the organelles. So we have these sequences of enzymes. It's not all just kind of a big pot. The enzymes for metabolism, for synthesis, and so on, they're all laid out, just like an assembly line. So this radiation basically throws a spanner in the works. So the blueprints are ruined. The DNA we have DNA damage in the nucleus. The energy production is disrupted in the mitochondria. The actual manufacturing is disrupted. The ribosomes, where we have the synthesis of amino acids, the endoplasmic reticulum, those are going to be affected by this microwave radiation. The Golgi apparatus that packages and transfers substances throughout the cell, the cellular membranes themselves are breached. And so we're seeing, we know that therapeutically, breaching of the cellular membranes with very, very brief and, albeit high power microwave radiation is used therapeutically to improve the penetration of chemotherapy. And we also know that there are synergistic effects with toxic chemicals. For instance, the study by Bion et al. In Korea, where they studied thousands of children, and they found that lead exposure synergized with exposure to cell phones to their heads in terms of the disruptive behaviors in school. This has implications for nerves because the myelin absorbs a lot less radiofrequency radiation than the axon itself. And so we can see that there's that stress at the interface, and we have demyelination.
5 minutes, ma'am.
We also have interference and changes in the transport of calcium and sodium and so on across the boundary of the axon, and that affects the transmission of nerves, nerve pulses.
5 minutes.
Thanks. I don't need to talk anymore about voltage-gated calcium channels. DNA damage is very common, and in fact, Dr. Blank and Goodman proposed that a DNA-based metric could be used to assess health effects of microwave radiation. We know that effects on sperm are very important as fertility has been decreasing in Western, particularly in Western societies. If we looked at the characteristics of carcinogens that were recently reported by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in their World Cancer Report, it's increasingly recognized that cancer is not caused by one thing. It develops as a result of several contributors. So on the left, we see the list, most of which will be induced by microwave radiation. And these are the similar ideas have been advanced before that also would mesh quite well with the effects of microwave radiation. This is the cost of healthcare in Canada. We have publicly funded healthcare. Healthcare costs are going up faster than our GDP. So this is really not very sustainable. And I doubt that we have any corner on that market. So in terms of policy and ethics, we have people say, well, this is a great experiment. It's a horrible experiment that is being imposed upon the globe. And I would say that this is really not an experiment, because if it was a scientific experiment, and here we get to the ethics, we'd have a justifiable hypothesis. There would be no adverse effect. We'd have prior approval of experimental design. We'd have data collection. We don't know what data, we have almost no data on exposures. We'd have ethical approval and informed consent. We would carry out interim analysis to halt this experiment at the first time of problems. And then, of course, we would have analyses and public reporting of results and discussion and implementation of logical next steps. And none of this is in place. So I just offer some other ideas for consideration in terms of next steps in schools, tracking fertility. In Canada, the Canadian Human Rights Commission has a policy for accommodation of environmental sensitivities, and actually wrote the medical report backing that up and included EHS in that. It's not very thoroughly enforced or anything. It's a policy, but nevertheless it is there. We would be moving to using mobile for only things that were absolutely essential for mobile, because lights and thermostats don't move. We would make wired easier, and we would require all devices to include a receiver for public signals. I have no idea why we have to stream our radio when radio is actually broadcast. And of course, we do have better options that must be implemented very carefully. And this is a big machine putting in fiber optic cable in Ontario. And we would really be implementing fiber as much as we possibly can. So I have to thank, I chair a group called Prevent Cancer Now, and I have to thank Environmental Health Trust and Canadians for Safe Technology and the many committed groups and individuals, and in particular yourselves, for inviting me today.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a quick question. Any question? Okay. Well, because we are actually about 20 minutes late as it is, Meg, well, thank you once again for your very intriguing talk.
Thank you very much.
Okay.